I am Pearl Dorr, the Public Outreach Manager here at IRIS headquarters, the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology here in Washington, D.C. IRIS is a 30-year-old consortium of universities and NSF-funded science facility that operates programs that enable Earth scientists to perform advanced research in geophysics, particularly in seismology. Today's research-focused webinar is either on, either highlights important to scientific results directly enabled by IRIS or represents important work by a partner organization. These webinars are recorded and archived on the IRIS YouTube channel, which you should see right now on your screen. And also listed at, I'll give you the URL at iris.edu/headquarter/webinar. So there are a couple of ground rules. Only the presenter and I will speak. If you have a comment or question as the seminar is taking place, then please clearly and concisely type it into the box in the webinar control panel. After the presentation, I will read your name and question to the speaker, and if some of the questions are similar, I may combine them. If the webinar crashes, which apparently has happened from time to time, it will get rebooted, and you just need to click again on the link that you received in your email. Also, it helps us to know if groups are watching this remotely. So if it's more than just one person, if you could let us know. Before our speaker gets started, I'd just like to say, take a few minutes to highlight some of the seismological facilities that IRIS has helped to operate and establish in Chile. Immediately after the Maule earthquake in 2010, with special funding from the National Science Foundation, IRIS operated a rapid array mobilization program deployment of about 50 EarthScope flex array broadband seismometers for 6 to 10 months in the Aftershock zone. There were numerous other international contributors who deployed stations as well, and these data were publicly available upon delivery to the IRIS Data Management Center under the network code _IMAD, which is short for the International Maule Aftershock Deployment. Sergio Barrientos, who is the head of the University of Chile's National Seismological Center, was one of our main collaborators, and he may be on this webinar today. But he cites the significant volunteering of time, money, and resources by many groups during the IMAD ramp, and cites it as an unprecedented example of international collaboration. In addition, in August 2010, the National Science Foundation sponsored the installation of 10 transportable array style broadband seismic stations that had a strong motion sensor, infrasound, and meteorological sensors. These stations have been operating since the summer of 2011, and according to Sergio Barrientos, they have produced a revolution in Chilean seismology. These stations, plus others in the IPOC network, and those were operated by GFC and IPGP in northern Chile, form the backbone of the permanent observational system of the Chilean National Seismological Center. So, without further ado, I want to present today's speaker, Stephen Hicks, who joins us from across the Atlantic. Stephen is a postgraduate student at the University of Liverpool in England, where he received his master's in 2011, studying mantle and isotropy under southern Chile. His activities related to Chile include helping to decommission some of the stations deployed to study the aftermath of the Maule earthquake. And so, without further commentary from me, here is Stephen to present the anatomy of a Megathrust earthquake rupture, the 2010 magnitude 8.8 Chile earthquake. Take it away.
Thank you, Pearl, for the introduction there. It's a real privilege to be invited to give today's webinar. So thank you to everyone who's joining us live, and thank you to those who will be listening to this at a later date, perhaps on YouTube. So today I'm going to describe how the combined efforts of the earthquake science community in the aftermath of a large earthquake in Chile have resulted in this event being one of the best earthquakes studied. And this really allows us a unique view into the inner workings of subduction earthquakes. So the focus on my work has been using seismic data from this earthquake to try and understand how the physical properties controlled its rupture, which is important for assessment of future hazard. So this work has really been the focus of my first 2.5 years as a PhD student at Liverpool. Today I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so. And if I have time, I'm going to briefly mention last week's strong earthquake in northern Chile and what we know about this so far. So I'd really like to thank my supervisors at Liverpool, that's Andreas Rupture and Isabel Ryder, and also collaborators based in Chile and Taiwan who have helped acquire part of the data set described in this talk. I'd like to thank the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK for funding this project. Finally, my Twitter handle is there. We have a good seismological community out there at the moment, and when a significant earthquake happens, there's always some lively discussion, so it'd be great to see some more of you there. Okay, so without further ado, on to the science. So subduction zones, we know, are where one plate sinks beneath the other. And we know that this process of subduction is really responsible for some of the world's largest earthquakes. They're important to study because large populations often live near active subduction margins, and so there's a high potential for shaking and tsunami hazards in many of these regions. So most strong earthquakes nucleate on this locked zone here. This is the shallow portion of the subduction zone.
Steve, can you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, sure. Is that a bit better?
If you can increase it a little bit more, that would be helpful.
Okay. Let me just. Okay, I'll try that. Okay, I brought the microphone closer to me. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so this lock zone is not as simple as a single lock zone because during large earthquakes, different parts of the seismogenic zone behave differently, and we can describe this using an asperity barrier framework. So asperities are regions of this lock zone that rupture strongly during an earthquake. Conversely, barriers are regions that tend to inhibit ruptures, and these are generally assumed to be regions of weaker lock-in. But it's not really known what are the physical origins of such asperities and barriers. So we can think about causes or features caused by subduction on the downgoing plates, such as seamounts, fracture zones, and ridges, which then become subducted and may influence somehow the rupture processes on the subduction zone. We can also think about features in the overriding plate, such as crustal faults, variations in the thickness of sediments in the subduction channel, and crustal batholiths. Okay, so the main question I'm trying to get to in this talk is, can we physically identify some of these asperities and barriers along the megathrust? And this is important these are important to identify because they could really help to constrain rupture potential in other subduction zones. But to be able to answer this question, we really need to know two things. We need to know how the megathrust behaved throughout the seismic cycle. And then we need to be able to relate this to the material properties along the megathrust fault zone itself. So to be able to answer this question, I think we need to be able to study a previous earthquake. And as given away in the title and introduction of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the Chilean subduction zone, which is really home to some of the world's largest earthquakes. Okay, so this map on the right shows the history of megathrust earthquakes along the south-central Chilean margin. And along this margin is where the Nazca plate subducts beneath the South America plate. So, for example, in 1960, we had the magnitude 9.5 Valdivia earthquake. And we can see from this map that these large earthquakes tend to fall into distinct segments. And these are separated by segment barriers given by the dashed lines here. So in this talk, I'm focusing on the Maule segment here. And there was a strong earthquake here in 1835, the Great Concepcion earthquake. And at the time, Charles Darwin was actually in the area visiting. And he recorded the effects of the large tsunami caused by this earthquake. So since 1835, there have been two strong earthquakes also. So we've had one in 1928 and one in 1939. But these were earthquakes that are still believed to have not filled the seismic gap. So for example, the 1939 earthquake is believed to have been an intraplate event that occurred within the downgoing slab. So it didn't actually fill the gap on the subduction interface. And this was recognized as a mature seismic gap back in a detailed study in 2009. So finally, on the 27th of February 2010, this gap was finally closed. And so the Maule earthquake is still the 6th largest earthquake ever recorded at magnitude 8.8. The earthquake nucleated here, which is just off the coastline between the city of Concepcion and Constitucion. It then went on to rupture bilaterally for 500 kilometers, so from the Arauco Peninsula in the south all the way to the north near the town of Pichilemu. So since this was such a significant earthquake, teams from institutions around the world that had experience of working in South America before then got in contact with each other. So the large size of the rupture area meant that multiple institutions had to be involved really to be able to study the after effects of this earthquake. And it was therefore agreed to make a combined deployment of seismometers to record aftershocks in the area. And this was called the International Maule Aftershock Deployment. And it was agreed that the data was not to be embargoed and made instantly available, perhaps the first large data set of its kind. So the deployment effort in the US was led by IRIS along with Caltech. We also had European partners involved from GFZ in Potsdam, CNRS in France, and the University of Liverpool along with SEIS UK from the UK. But this deployment couldn't have happened at all without excellent field and logistics support from the University of Chile in Santiago and the University of Concepcion. The first stations were deployed within about 3 weeks, so this was really a rapid response to a big event. So the aim of the deployment was to really cover the rupture zone all the way from the coastline to the Andes. Working in the area was tricky in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. For example, near Concepcion, there was a crucial bridge which had collapsed and other important road links were destroyed, whilst strong aftershocks were still occurring. From a more scientific point of view, in the south of the rupture zone, we were lucky to have 2 islands located there. And so we deployed stations there, which allowed us to get a better view of aftershocks which were occurring further offshore. So to get to these islands, we had to hire small planes. Further east in the Andes, a number of our seismometer sites were on land owned by the Chilean army, so we had to negotiate with these guys to put our stations there, but they were incredibly supportive and provided great assistance to us. And as Pearl mentioned earlier, I was lucky enough to take part in the final stages of this project, and it's really great to have a direct handle on the data you are using in research. And unfortunately, this is not always the case. So I think I speak on behalf of all teams when I say this, that we're really appreciative of the Chilean farmers and landowners, as well as colleagues who were very, very helpful in this deployment. Okay, so let's have a look at the final station distribution. So this map on the right shows the location of all the IMAD stations. In total, we had 160 land stations which were deployed across the Rupture area. And yeah, most stations were deployed within 1 month, with the best station coverage really peaking between April and June. And in some places, the station spacing was as little as 15 to 20 kilometers apart. So not only have we got a big seismic network, it's actually also quite dense. So since this is an IRIS hosted webinar, I thought I'd just plug the data which is available on the IRIS DMC. This is available under the virtual network code IMAD, but you can also access the individual institutions' data. So that's station network code XS for the French, 3A for the British data, XY for the US. For the German data, that can be found on the GFZ Geofon website or through webdc.eu, and that's under network code ZE. Now, most activity, both during the earthquake and after the earthquake, occurred offshore. So we had a lot of slip offshore, both co-seismically and post-seismically. So it was therefore important to have ocean bottom instruments in the area. So these were not officially part of the IMAD deployment, but we were lucky enough to have several OBS deployments in the area. So we had one ocean bottom seismometer network in the north, and this was around 20 stations which were deployed by the National Taiwan Ocean University. And these were deployed from July 2010 to September 2010. In the south here, we had about 10 stations deployed by the UK Ocean Bottom Consortium in partnership with the University of Liverpool. And we had about 12 stations here from August until December 2010. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the original question I posed earlier on. So to be able to really identify these asperities and barriers, we need to know how the megathrust behaved over the seismic cycle. And this is where most work has been done so far, and particularly on the co-seismic slip distribution during the Maule earthquake. So we've really had a plethora of co-seismic slip models already produced. And these slip models generally can come from data sets including GPS, INSAR, tsunami gauges, land level changes, and teleseismic waveforms. Each of these studies uses a slightly different combination of data and slightly different smoothing constraints. But I'm going to focus on two of these in this talk, which are two of the most recently published, and that's the paper of Lin 2013 and Moreno et al. In 2012. Now, the Lin et al. Paper uses perhaps the most comprehensive data set of tsunami gauges, so therefore we believe it has the best offshore resolution of the slip models. And the Moreno paper in 2012, that has perhaps the best and the biggest GPS data set. So that has, we think, the best onshore constraints. But actually all of these models are quite similar and show the same features to first order. So let's have a look now at one of these slip models. And this is the slip model of Moreno et al. 2012. So on the map, we've got the cooler colors representing areas of lower slip, and the warmer colors representing areas of higher slip. And as you can see to first order, that most slip occurred really between the trench and the coastline. But the surprising feature of this earthquake was that most slip occurred around 150 kilometers to the north of the initial nucleation point. And this was surprising because it was this area around the hypercenter, which was believed to be the most locked pre-seismically. So there was a maximum slip at this of around 16 meters at this northern asperity. So we really have a good idea of how the megathrust behaved co-seismically, but we also have a good idea of the post-seismic deformation. And this is one thing we can study of post-seismic deformation are aftershock locations. And so these aftershocks have been measured using the IMAD deployment. And these are generally locations based on automatically picked phases. So we can see that most aftershocks are located offshore, and there's a much greater density of aftershocks in the northern half of the area. In the central and southern areas beneath the land, there's this clear patchiness in aftershock seismicity. So let's have a look at some cross sections through these to really get an idea of the depth distribution of aftershocks. So we can see that we've got 5 cross sections here. AA prime is in the north, EE prime is in the south, and the aftershocks define a nice plate interface as approximated by the white line here. But there's certainly in the north there was a region of pronounced crustal seismicity, and this is believed to be related to this 2 strong Chile aftershocks that occurred shortly after the Maule main shock. And these are events which generally show extensional to strike slip focal mechanisms. Perhaps more interestingly is this gap in seismicity along the plate interface that we see in the central and northern areas of the rupture zone. And this really separates the main band of interface seismicity from this lower cluster of aftershocks. And some of these aftershocks we believe to have we believe they show repeated waveforms. So there might be quite a lot of repeating earthquakes occurring there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this original question. So we really have a good idea of the megathrust dynamics over the seismic cycle. We also know about the pre-seismic lock-in distribution as well as after slip, but I will come on to those a little bit later. So the missing piece really now is to try and understand what the material properties are along the megathrust fault zone. And we can try and infer these from seismic velocities. And my work has been focused on trying to understand the seismic velocities through the local earthquake tomography method. And I've used aftershocks following the earthquake to try and derive a tomographic model of the rupture zone. So here's a quick primer on seismic tomography. So I've set up a kind of a basic problem here. We've got an earthquake located within the downgoing plate, and we've got a station located on the Forearc up here. And so if we measure the arrival time of P and S waves at this station, we can try and understand the average velocity along the ray path here. But in reality, we know that the Earth is not actually like this, and we do have quite a lot of lateral changes in seismic velocities. So what I've done here is I've put in a high velocity anomaly V3 and a low velocity anomaly V2. So at this station, we will see a much later arrival of P and S waves, and at this one, we will see a much earlier arrival because it travels through faster material. But again, using this setup, we're not actually resolving properly the correct geometry and amplitude of these anomalies. So what we really need is more sources and more stations. And we need a good distribution of earthquakes. We need deep earthquakes, we need shallow earthquakes, and this really gives us lots of ray paths, which we can then build up, and we see good ray path coverage throughout the area with ray paths going in different directions, and that can then allow us to really constrain the geometry and amplitude of any seismic velocity anomalies. So to do this, we need to carry out an inversion technique, and so to do a tomographic inversion, we need 3 inputs. We need the P and S wave travel times, so that's the data set. We need a good idea of the earthquake locations to start with, and we also need a good idea of the velocity structure in the area. This is through a 1D velocity model. So then we use these inputs and go through a least squares inversion, where we then solve for a new velocity model, and we also get new earthquake locations, so it's a joint inversion. And the strategy I've applied is to go through a staggered approach, which is where instead of inverting straight away for a 3D starting model, 3D velocity model, sorry, we go from a 1D to a 2D velocity model, and then use that 2D velocity model as a starting model for the 3D inversion. And we're also inverting for both the P wave velocity, VP, and the VP-VS ratio, as both the interpretation of both of these can give you a good idea of the composition and structure of the subsurface. So we use this 2D velocity model as a starting model for a 3D inversion, and then we get a final 3D model and final 3D locations. So in any of these geophysical inversion methods, it's really important to be able to understand the resolving capability of your model. And we do this through both analysis of the resolution matrix, and we also test characteristic forward models. And I will come on to that a little bit later. So the inversion algorithm I have used is Simul 2000, which has been around for quite some time and is very much tried and tested. So now let's have a look at the data set that we end up with. So I've used the full number of stations available. That's 160 onshore and 37 ocean bottom seismometer stations. I've picked 670 aftershocks from the Rupture area. These are generally the largest and best recorded events, but I also select this catalogue in order to be able to get a good distribution of earthquakes from across the area to ensure that we have even resolving capabilities throughout the model. Now this ends up with a high quality catalogue of 38,000 P-wave picks and 14,000 S-wave picks, and these I have manually picked. So if you're familiar with our previous tomographic model for this region that we published in GRL in 2012, the difference now is that instead of using automatic picks, we're using much higher quality manual picks, and the increase in the data set, increased size in the data set that we have now means that we can resolve much smaller features, so we have a much smaller nodal space in the tomographic grid. So let's have a look at the 2D velocity model that we get from this. So just to get your eye in here, this is a velocity model. This is the P-wave velocity model, which is plotted on a cross-section perpendicular to the trench. And this broadly represents the average seismic velocities in the Rupture area. The grey triangle here represents the location of the coastline, and the white line represents the resolution limit. So we don't try and interpret features outside of this area. So the main feature that you can see is this dipping band of seismicity along here. and this we believe to be the Megathrust plate interface. And we can check this by looking at moment tensors from published moment tensors from the aftershocks. And most of these show thrust-in mechanisms, so we are happy that this is the Megathrust interface. So we can plot a polynomial through that, a best fit in line, by fixing this location to the trench up here. So that's our approximate plate interface geometry. So now we can try and interpret some more features from this. So the region of around 7.5 kilometers per second around here. This is the subducting oceanic lithosphere. Thought I'd just say actually that warmer colors represent higher velocities and cooler colors represent lower velocities. Okay, so yeah, this is the subducting slab, we believe. Now this region of low velocity is less than 6 kilometers per second. We believe this to be related to the accretionary complex. The green velocities are velocities of around 6 to 7 kilometers per second, and we believe that makes up the main framework of the continental Forearc crust. And this strange feature down here with P-wave velocities of 7.5 kilometers per second or more, we believe to represent the very far corner of the continental mantle wedge. And this is a feature which has been observed across the region, and it appears to be laterally continuous. So here are those basic interpretations from the model. So this is now the 2D VPVS ratio model. And so warmer colors here represent a high VPVS ratio, as the cooler colors represent lower VPVS ratio. So the two features of interest here are really this very high region of VPVS ratio in the shallow depths in the marine Forearc. This has values of 2.1 greater, and so we believe this to be related to perhaps overpressured sediments within the accretionary complex. We also see an elevated VPVS ratio anomaly, which is coincident with the location of the subducting slab. And we imaged this down to around 45 to 50 kilometers depth. And we think this may be due to either hydration within the oceanic crust itself, or perhaps a high pore fluid pressure within the subduction channel along the plate interface. Okay, so that's our 2D model, and now we can go into 3D to really see if we can image any changes in velocity structure along strike or in the trench parallel direction. So our nodal spacing that we use in 3D is 55 kilometers, and these are given by these small black crosses here. But for simplicity's sake, I am just going to plot the 3D model on 5 different cross sections, similar to the way I plotted the aftershocks earlier. So again, AA prime is in the north, and EE prime is in the south. So here are those 5 different cross sections, and as you can see, we are really we image most of the features that we saw in the 2D model. There are significant places of interest though. I mean, this region here is on the CEC prime cross section, and this is a very high velocity anomaly of up to 8 kilometers per second, which lies beneath the coast around here, just slightly deeper than the nucleation point of the main shock. We also we see that this then tails off and gets smaller towards the south. In the north, we also have a region of high seismic velocities up to around 7.7 kilometers per second, and this is beneath the Piccolami region, where we had the intense crustal activity in the aftershock sequence. So let's have a brief look also at the 3D VPVS model. Again, we're really seeing the same features we did in the 2D model. So we've got high VPVS anomalies in this shallow portion of the marine Forearc, and we're also imaging the the slightly elevated VPVSs that were associated with the downgoing plate. The take-home message from this, though, is that where we had the high P wave velocity before, in the center of the rupture area, it's around here, we now have slightly elevated VPVS ratios of about 1.8 to 1.81. So one question we need to ask ourselves is really how well are we imaging these anomalies? And to do this, to test this, and to constrain our uncertainties, we go through a restoring resolution test. And what we've done is designed a synthetic model that we believe somehow represents the real structure of the Earth. So we've put in, like the actual 3D model, a high P wave anomaly just above the plate interface here in the center of the rupture area. Then we've got a planar interface further north. Then we come into another high P wave anomaly located slightly shallower in the Forearc here. So we really want to understand, are we somehow exaggerating the sizes of these? Are they being smeared in the trend parallel direction? And are we really finding their true locations in our model? So we've got this input model. We then shoot some rays through it using our original source receiver distribution. We calculate the travel times, and then we add noise to these travel times to really reflect the noise in our data. Okay, then we go through the original inversion process, and this is the model we get out. And as you can see, the recovered model is very similar to the input model. In most places, we are really recovering the amplitudes of anomalies to plus or minus 2%, which is great. So it would appear that our model setup is not exaggerating the size of these features, and it's also putting them in their correct location. So this one is much deeper in the Forearc, whereas this one appears much shallower. Furthermore, we don't see any smearing along strike in this region here. So I think we can trust the location and geometry of the features we are seeing in our 3D model. So we want to try and interpret and understand what these features actually are, what's the composition, and what is their origin. So this is just a cut through the 3D model at 25 kilometers depth. So this is just a horizontal depth slice. And this is now plotted in map view. So in the shallow regions here, we're in the subducting slab, but then as we go further east, we then enter again the Forearc crust, and we can see our two high velocity anomalies located in the central region here, and further north close to the Piccolomini region. And these have P-wave velocities of around 7.8 kilometers per second and a VPVS ratio of around 1.8. So to be able to try and interpret these, we can look at other geophysical data sets. The most obvious one to go for is to see if they have a signature in the gravity anomaly for the region. So in the next slide, I'm plotting this gravity anomaly, and I'm just keeping these high velocity contours of 7.5 kilometers per second or greater and overlaying them. So this is the Forearc Bouguer gravity field for the region. And as we can see, there's a very high gravity anomaly located exactly where we have these high velocities, which is great. Also further north, we're just about fitting higher gravity anomalies, and perhaps also to the south. So what we really have is, based on the velocities and the gravity field, it appears that we have an ultramafic, a rock which is composed of ultramafic material. And it's quite a large body, and perhaps it's weakly serpentinized based on experimental data. So one explanation for this feature could be that it is a subducted topographic anomaly, such as a seamount or an oceanic ridge. And this is the conclusion we came to in our 2012 GRL paper. However, with our improved data set and much smaller nodal resolution, the size of this anomaly has actually got much bigger and much faster than we thought. So we believe it's not plausible anymore for there to have been a recently subducted seamount lying in this location here. Other evidence might come from the surface geology. So here are those high velocity contours now overlain on a simplified geological map for the region. So these coastal ranges along here, mainly composed of late Paleozoic granitic batholiths, and these are given by the pink regions here. There's not as such a one-to-one relationship between the locations of the granite outcrops and the high velocities. Furthermore, the velocities we believe are too high to be related to a granitic type material. Even if we were to think about a residual magmatic intrusion lying perhaps at the base of these granites, we would expect a much lower VPVS ratio. In fact, we are finding that these anomalies have a VPVS ratio of about 1.8. An alternative explanation might lie in the fact that we have small Triassic mafic intrusions located along the various places along the coastline, given by the arrows here. And it's believed that these intrusions have quite a deep source, so they're believed to be sourced from the mantle. And they've been related to an extensional phase during the Triassic. And this has in turn been related to causes such as lithospheric delamination and astenospheric upwellings of mantle material. So it could be plausible that perhaps this body we are seeing is an old piece of mantle that's now lying at the base of the modern Forearc. So I'm going to go back to this original question again, and if we want to be able to relate, if we want to understand what may control dynamics along the megathrust, we really need to know what the velocities along the megathrust actually are. So based on our 3D model and 3D locations, we've now calculated a 3D interface geometry for the region, and we can check that this is a good estimate of the interface by looking at published moment tensor solutions. So this histogram shows all the thrusting mechanisms from the aftershocks, and most of these lie along our plate interface. And our interface has a fairly good fit with previous estimates for the plate interface in this region. So now we've got this 3D plate interface, I'm now going to extract the velocities from the 3D model along this new geometry. So these are the P-wave velocities along the megathrust projected up to the surface and plotted in map view. So we see these lower velocities over here, closer to the trench, and these likely represent the base of the accretionary complex. As we then get closer to the coastline itself, we then have a strong increase in P-wave velocity, and we then get to what we believe to be a basal expression of these high P-wave velocity ultramafic bodies in the center here and in the north here. Whereas in this region here, near Constitution, we see much reduced P-wave velocity in comparison to the adjacent regions. Then, as the deeper we get, we then end up in a slightly lower velocity region, and then around here, along this region here, the subducting plate then enters the continental mantle, and the velocities really start to increase again. So we can have a look at the equivalent of the VP-VS ratio now. So again, like we saw in the cross sections, we have this this region of very high VP-VS at the base of the marine Forearc. But in general, the slab has, or the plate interface region appears to have a slightly elevated VPVS ratio of about 1.82 to 1.84. And then as the plate descends into the mantle, we then get much reduced VPVS ratios. So I'm now going to compare these velocities to our understanding of how the megathrust behaved over the seismic cycle. So first, I'm going to look at the pre-seismic lock-in distribution. And what I've plotted here are the 70% contours of pre-seismic lock-in. And so we see that the greatest lock-in was actually in this region here between the trench and the coastline, where we see intermediate P-wave velocities of around 7 kilometers per second, but we see quite a high gradient in P-wave velocities in the down dip direction. It's also interesting to note that this high P-wave velocity anomaly here seems to correspond to a patch of high lock-in, but because this is quite a small patch, we're not sure if this is just an artifact in the lock-in model. Let's now have a look at the co-seismic rupture. So the star here represents the main shock nucleation point, and we see that this is coincident with the up-dip edge of this high P-wave anomaly, where the P-wave velocity gradients are quite high. The co-seismic slip model is represented by the blue contours, and I've plotted that for regions of significant slip, i.e. more than regions that slipped of more than 6 meters. And again, most slip occurred away from the coastline, where we see these high velocities, and away from these much lower velocity regions closer to the trench. The highest slip asperity in the north appears to be coincident with where we have much lower velocities beneath the coast, and therefore we seem to have a lower P-wave velocity gradient in the down dip direction. Finally, I've also plotted in these white circles the locations of high frequency energy release during the main shock, and these are from the model of Kissa and Ishii in 2011. So we see that the high frequency energy release started around here, then it seems to migrate down dip and travel along this lower velocity region until then it jumps up dip again to the lower velocities, and as it goes further north it seems to travel down dip again beneath a down dip of this high velocity region near Chile. Okay, finally, for the post-seismic, I've relocated all the aftershocks from 2010 and plotted those that occur along and around the plate interface in grey here. And the blue contours represent regions of strong afterslip, more than 1 meters from Linatau 2013. And it was believed that most afterslip was actually aseismic. So most aftershock activity actually occurs in this narrow corridor between the lower velocities of the marine Forearc and the higher velocities between the coast. And then the afterslip again occurs in much lower velocity regions, generally at greater depths. So let's have a look at this relationship between aftershock distribution and seismic velocity in a bit more detail. So here I've plotted 3D cross sections again, but zoomed in on these two anomalies and plotted all the relocated aftershock seismicity from 2010. And as you can see, these high velocity anomalies in both cases seem to fill or be situated in the gap that we saw in plate interface seismicity from the initial aftershock location. And the Picholemu crustal aftershocks seem to appear up dip of the anomaly, and it's plausible that this high velocity anomaly here may have acted as maybe a structural heterogeneity in the Forearc, which may have contributed to this crustal seismicity. A quick look at the VPVS now along the Megathrust interface. I'll just point out a couple of things, that the region of greatest slip occurs in it occurs down dip of this much higher VPVS region in the shallow marine Forearc. And again, that's the same with the aftershocks. So these, we barely see any aftershocks in this high VPVS region. Okay, so a bit of a summary diagram here then. What I've plotted are the velocities along the plate interface and the range of velocities along the plate interface against depth of the plate interface. So this is the P wave velocity, and this here is Poisson's ratio, which is directly related to VPVS ratio. The orange histogram here represents the plate interface aftershock seismicity, and the blue and red lines are the two co-seismic slip models of Moreno and Lin. Okay, so we see in the velocities several distinct regimes, suggesting that we have a down dip segmentation of the megathrust. So in the shallow region here, down to around 20 kilometers, we really see low P wave velocity values, but a much elevated VPVS ratio. And there's a big drop off in aftershock seismicity as well. And perhaps also, as suggested by the Lin et al. Co-seismic slip model, there's a drop off in co-seismic slip. As we then go to depths of 20 to 50 kilometers, we get a sharp increase in the P wave velocity anomaly here, and a sort of a slightly elevated Poisson's ratio of about 0.29. And this is the region where we have the greatest aftershock seismicity and the greatest amount of co-seismic slip during the rupture. In the green line here, I've just plotted the velocities close to this central high velocity anomaly, and the red line is the velocity through the region of greatest co-seismic slip. So in this region of 30 to 45 kilometers, then we see these higher P wave velocities, which seem to be influenced by crustal anomalies, which then corresponds to a reduced aftershock activity and a reduced and a reduced amount of co-seismic slip. And then we also, in this final deep region, then we see around at depths of around 45 to 50 kilometers, a slight drop off in the P wave velocity, a slight increase in the VPVS ratio or Poisson's ratio, and then an increase in the aftershock seismicity. So this is this down dip cluster that we saw in the preliminary aftershock distribution. So it appears that these ultramafic bodies in the Forearc may have inhibited propagation of the rupture during the Maule earthquake. And there's really minimal slip where P wave velocities of around 7.5 kilometers per second are found on the megathrust. And this goes for both seismic and aseismic slip. A high VPVS region in the marine Forearc seems to correlate with the up-dip limit of seismogenesis for the Maule earthquake. And the localization of afterslip within the lower velocity regions suggests that afterslip may be compositionally driven. So going back to the original question, it appears that maybe the long-lived geological structure of the overriding plate can act as a barrier during an earthquake. And it appears that the location of these barriers then somehow controls the location of asperities also. And we also have, for the Maule earthquake, a barrier to rupture at the up-dip end where we have fluid-saturated sediments. Okay, I'm just going to talk for about 5 minutes more. I'm going to change tack slightly and move away from the scientific findings and just think about what the seismological community has learned about rapid deployments and the longer-term monitoring of subduction earthquakes. So just over a year ago, all those involved in the deployment and those who have worked with the dataset met in Concepcion, Chile, for an excellent workshop that was organized by IRIS. And here's a report of this workshop in one of the local newspapers, and some of you might, in fact, recognize some familiar faces here. So the aim of this workshop was to not only share scientific findings, but also to discuss the lessons learned from this rapid deployment of instruments. So from my point of view, here are some of the most important lessons we need to learn. Firstly, since most subduction ruptures occur offshore, ocean bottom measurements are really needed to fully characterize the bulk of the seismogenic zone, especially if we want to understand better the potential hazards from ruptures that occur close to and maybe up to the trench. The ocean bottom deployment was not included in the initial plan for the Maule deployment. So one big improvement we could make in future efforts is really to incorporate the OBS community into future rapid deployments and to have that data open in the same way as the land data. As I've shown, the seismic velocity structure may be an important parameter for constraining earthquake hazard, particularly in areas of seismic quiescence. Though we really need active source experiments such as refraction, wide-angle refraction studies to really delineate the geometry of the plate interface and the velocity structure, because we just don't have the background seismicity in these regions. From the UK point of view, we were actually quite lucky to be involved in the deployment, because the equipment from our central pool only happened to be available at that time. And so I think there needs to be a greater development of community instrument pools and getting a policy framework for such rapid deployments ready before these earthquakes happen. And this could allow smaller research institutions to get involved in such further deployments in the future. So just for the last 2 minutes now, I'm going to change tack for the last time and just show a couple of slides that I've recently added in the last week. And so this is about the earthquake that struck Chile last week. This occurred in the well-known northern Chile seismic gap. And once the Maule segment had been ruptured, then this was perhaps one of the big last seismic gaps in North America. So this earthquake was a magnitude 8.2. Its thrust mechanism and depth are consistent with thrusting along the plate interface between the Nazca and South American plates. And these warm colors down here represent the co-seismic slip, the preliminary finite fault model of the USGS, indicating that most slip up to around 6.5 meters occurred to the southeast. One perhaps surprising thing about this earthquake was that this slip occurs deeper, and we don't often see this with most large subduction earthquakes. Generally, the large slip occurs up dip or parallel to the main shock nucleation point. But this earthquake didn't take us completely by surprise. It was preceded by 2 strong fault shock sequences in mid to late March. So the seismological community was always a bit on edge, as were the Chileans as well, I think. And this began with a magnitude 6.7 earthquake in mid-March, which has a thrusting mechanism, but the nodal plane is slightly strange and appears to be very oblique to the trench. So I think that needs further study. We then had a second cluster a few days later, which appeared to have moved a little further north than the first cluster. Then we had 5 or so days of reduced seismic activity. Then finally, on the 1st of April, the main magnitude 8.2 earthquake occurred, and then we had aftershocks located throughout this entire region. So as I've said before, this occurred in a well-known seismic gap, but let's have a look at this earthquake now in terms of historic ruptures in northern Chile. So recent ruptures that occurred in this area were the 2001 magnitude 8.4 southern Peru earthquake and the Tocopilla earthquake magnitude 7.7, which occurred in 2007. So this was this region here. This was believed to be the 1877 seismic gap. This is when the 1877 was when the last large earthquake was believed to have been in this region. So it appears that this magnitude 8.2 earthquake has partially filled the gap. But perhaps more worryingly is this region to the south, which is only partially filled by Tocopilla. And as the colours show, this is believed to be a region of high coupling between the 2 plates. So I think this needs to be the next focus of the seismological community who are working in South America. So I'm just putting up some brief summary points from the talk. I'm not going to go through them, but I will leave them up and let you read them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Steve. It was great talk, and we appreciate the additional slides for the Chile earthquake of earlier this month. Right now, we've got a couple of questions. One from Bill Harbert. He said, in the presented 3D velocity structure model, could the CC prime P wave velocity feature be correlated with any gravity inversion feature?
Okay.
Gravity inverted for the 2.5D structure, and then compared, for example, with the velocity structure along cross section CC prime. This gravity inversion model would be very well constrained by the determined megathrust geometry.
Okay, so I can't hear you particularly clearly, but I think the question was something like, can you jointly invert for the P wave velocity structure and the gravity structure? Is that the question, or is it just a sort of a very qualitative comparison between the two?
Let's see.
Can you...
So gravity inverted for the 3.5D structure and then compared with the velocity structure along the cross section CC prime.
Okay, so I showed the comparison between gravity and velocity anomalies, and there's a very good, excellent comparison between the two. There seems to be a one-to-one correlation. We haven't yet sort of tried to jointly invert for both the gravity structure and the velocity structure. I think this is an area of work that we plan to do, and I think could reveal better the composition of that high velocity, high density body we are seeing there. But yeah, I think it was when we initially saw the gravity model, it was surprising that there was such a good correlation between that and the velocity. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, the next question is, could the deep seismic zone between 45 and 50 kilometers be wave reflection?
Be what, sorry?
So Joel Wick asked, could the deep seismic zone between 45 and 50 kilometers be wave reflection?
Wave reflection. I don't understand what wave reflection is. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's... We're very confident that this cluster of seismicity exists there. All I can say is that some of these events have very similar waveforms to each other. So this suggests that they have a very similar mechanism indeed, and that's why it appears that they are repeating earthquakes and may be related to somehow fluid release within fluid release from the subducting slab. But that's, I don't think I fully understood the question, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, and we've got one other question from Anatoly Koshulko. What can you say about the nature of the forces causing large earthquakes, whether mathematical experiment planning in the sense of placing stations?
Okay, sorry, can you repeat that again, please? You were breaking up a little bit.
What can you say about the nature of the forces causing large earthquakes?
Okay, yeah, I guess that these large earthquakes appear to be as a result of the kind of built-up stress between the subducting slab and the overriding plate, and that if these two plates are locked over a period such as 180 years, which is when the 1835 earthquake happened, the last earthquake in that region, then I think you can then understand what the slip deficit is along the Megathrust interface, and then try and constrain what the potential rupture size is. Again, yeah, I don't think I really got that question, but
yeah, I think that part of it has to do with how this impacts the future planning for experiments, where to place stations in the future.
Ah, okay. Sorry, I see. I was thinking more about tectonic forces. Okay. Yeah, I think further work needs to be done on this particular region. For example, it would be good to understand the nature of this high velocity anomaly, maybe work out it better, kind of understand its composition better, which might be achieved through a large scale active source study. But I think we need to, in regions such as northern Chile, there's been what's called the IPOC, Integrated Plate Observatory Network, deployed by the GFZ group in Germany, and they've really been monitoring this seismic gap there for a long time. So there's, I think, a lot to be said for placing stations before earthquakes to really understand, for example, foreshock sequences and the actual rupture itself. Okay.
Great, thanks for addressing that. I don't see any other questions that have been submitted. So I want to thank you again, Steve, for a wonderful presentation on a very timely topic. And again, we'll repeat that the webinar will be posted on the IRIS YouTube channel as well as on the website in a couple of weeks. And stay tuned for further webinars from IRIS. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.